Africa's fight for independence, struggles, negotiations, and the cost of freedom. For decades, African nations struggled under colonial rule, facing oppression and exploitation by European powers. But through resilience, bravery, and strategy, they fought for and won their independence. In my previous videos, I discussed the lifestyle of African before the coming of Western nations and the struggles they have to face during the imperialism. In this video, we'll explore how African countries earned their freedom through force, negotiations, and the price they paid for their sovereignty. By the 20th centuries, all of Africa was under colonial rule. Countries like the UK, France, Portugal, and Belgium, each exploiting the continent and its people. But as the winds of change began to sweep the world, African leaders and citizens started to demand their rights and freedom. For some nations, the fight for independence was violent, marked by armed resistance and revolutionary warfare. Countries like Algeria, Kenya, and Angola took up arms against their colonial rulers. Algeria fought against French rule in a brutal war that lasted from 1954 to 1962. The National Liberation Front, FLN, led the armed struggle, resulting in significant loss of life, but ultimately securing independence. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising, led by the Kikuyu people from 1952 to 1960, sought to end British colonial rule through guerrilla warfare, despite heavy repression and massacres. Angola. In the 1960s and 1970s, Angola's armed resistance, particularly by the MPLA, People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, fought against Portuguese colonialists until independence in 1975. While some African nations fought in the trenches, others achieved independence through negotiation and peaceful resistance. In many cases, leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and Nelson Mandela emphasized non-violent protest, political dialogue, and negotiations. Ghana. The first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence in 1957, Kwame Nkrumah led peaceful protests and strategic negotiations with the British government, showing that it was possible to gain independence without armed conflict. South Africa. Under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, the African National Congress, ANC, used both non-violent resistance and armed struggle, but eventually negotiations led to the dismantling of apartheid in the 1990s. Nigeria. Nigeria gained independence from Britain in 1960 through negotiations, spearheaded by political leaders like Nnamdi Azikiwe and Obafemi Awolowo. Independence came at a cost. For many African nations, this involved difficult compromises and sacrifices. While they gained sovereignty, they also faced challenges that would impact their future development. Many African countries had to balance political power between multiple factions, which sometimes led to civil strife. In some cases, colonial powers left behind weak political institutions, leading to instability. Example. In Congo, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Belgium granted independence in 1960, but political turmoil followed, with a coup and assassination of Patrice Lumumba, largely due to the hasty transfer of power. Trade and resources. African nations were often forced to rely on the same colonial economic systems after independence, which centered around raw materials and trade agreements that favored former colonial powers. Debt. Many newly independent African countries inherited foreign debts from their colonial rulers and had to make economic concessions, which slowed their growth. Independence often meant the loss of pre-colonial political and cultural systems, as colonial powers imposed Western-style governments and legal systems. South Africa's journey to independence was unique. Although it gained independence in 1910, its system of apartheid, a harsh form of racial segregation, continued until 1994. The struggle to dismantle apartheid involved decades of peaceful resistance and international pressure. Nelson Mandela, long imprisonment, and the eventual negotiations with the apartheid government paved the way for a democratic South Africa.